So now let's take a look at ASP.NET Core Identity. In this module, we're going to take a look at the Authorize attribute, how to configure identity, storing identity with Entity Framework Core, and using identity in the API. Now let's talk about what ASP.NET Core Identity is. It's a replacement for the old ASP.NET membership facility that was in ASP.NET. ASP.NET Core Identity also supports different types of authentication, including cookies, OAuth 2, and even JSON Web Tokens. ASP.NET Core Identity is pluggable, which means you have complete control over how you store your entities and what properties are on them. You can store your entities or get your entities from non-relational sources, not just databases. You can even look at LDAP and AD stores for getting your identities. Let's see what this looks like in practice. Let's start with authorizing actions. So let's go to the layout, and we're just going to make a copy of this last nav item so we can add support for shop. So we've got the app controller's app, which is correct, but the app action is going to be shop, and of course, the item itself will be shop. Let's open up that app controller where we have the call for shop. We can add an attribute here called authorize, and that is in the ASP.NET Core authorization namespace. And what we're effectively saying is we're going to need whoever calls this to actually be logged in or have some credential. We're essentially saying that some authentication has to have taken place here. Now, if you're using something like integrated Windows authentication, this will guarantee that the person has come through with a Windows credential. But we're going to be talking about how identity works with it. Let's launch this. And here we have that new shop section. Let's click on that. And we'll immediately get an error that says no authentication scheme was specified and there's no default challenge scheme. This is fancy word for saying we forgot to set up identity. Effectively, we need to tell the website how we're going to authorize people. But before we can set that up, we're going to need to have a way to store the identities or the people that we want to be able to log into our system. Let's do that next. Next, let's figure out a way to store identities in the database. Over in our project, let's go to the entities and create a new entity called store user. You can call it anything you want, but we'll say store user. And out of the box, one of the default ways to get identity working is to use the built-in identity that's written on top of Entity Framework Core. So we're actually going to derive this from another class called Identity User. And that'll be in ASP.NET Core Identity. And let's look at that class for a minute. This is a user that knows what kind of username there is. So let's drill down into the generic version. And we can start to see we have a lot of built-in properties that can be used for identity. Lockout, phone number confirmed, phone number, password hash, normalized email, username, etc. And so by using this, we're really saying we want to have a user that has a bunch of these identity default properties, but we may want to add our own. So all we need to do in order to add properties that we might want to use is add properties we might want to use. So I'm going to create a property for first name and a property for last name. And so what we're getting is all the properties from identity user plus the properties we need. But to actually store these in the simplest way, again, there are ways for you to completely customize how you're storing or to use existing entities. But for our needs, we're going to really rely on the default implementation in identity to do that. And so what we need to do is actually go to the Dutch context. And instead of deriving from DB context, we're going to derive from identity DB context. And here if we try to add a using statement for our identity DB context, it can't find it. And that's because we need a reference. So let's right click that dependencies and go to manage NuGet packages. And here we're just going to look for one called Microsoft ASP.NET Core.Identity.Entity Framework Core. This is where Identity and Entity Framework Core meet. So let's just go ahead and install that. It's going to ask us to bring in a few other pieces. And once we've done that, ignore these errors. We'll be able to see that if we come back to the Identity DB context, it'll actually allow us to add that using statement. And what we're really going to want is the generic version that takes our store user, that new user we just created, as the identity type. We could actually just use the identity user that's existing, but I wanted to be able to add other elements to that. And more importantly, if I go over to the order entity, I also want to be able to set store user as the user that owns that order. And this way I'm tying the identity piece into the actual order system. Now that we've made those changes, notice we didn't need to add support for looking at the users here. We'll actually be able to do that. And there's some other classes for being able to get at the users and log in without having to go through our context. We'll look at a couple of those different options as we go forward. But the first thing we need to do is open up a console window, because we're going to need to actually add some migrations. Because we've expanded the data model to include these entity pieces, we have to actually go to .NET EF migrations like we did earlier, add, and I'm going to just call it the identity migration. So if we go back to Visual Studio and look at migrations, we have a new class that's been generated called Identity, the same name we did. And this has code in it to tell it to create the new tables, to create the new relationships, and even to modify the order table because we made that change. Back in the console, let's go ahead and just use the EF tooling again to drop the database since we've made such a big change. And then next time we run it, all those migrations will be executed for us. Now that we have the data model all sorted out, let's open up that seeder. And in the seeder, we're going to look inside the seed method right after we ensure the database is created. And we're just going to look for a store user, just like the kind of store user we defined earlier. I'm just going to call it a user, and I want to be able to use an object called a user manager. But let's come back to that for a minute, because we're going to need to inject the user manager into our .seeder. The user manager class takes the store user as a generic parameter to know what kind of user this user manager can manage. And then we'll just call it a user manager, and then we'll use create a field and initialize it. We're all good. And so the user manager is going to allow us to find this user by email. And our email is going to be sean@dutchtreat.com. We're getting an error here, and this is expected because this is an asynchronous operation that's find by email. So we actually have to use a wait here, but we can't use a wait until we make seed an asynchronous method. So we're going to start by adding the async keyword, changing the void to a task, and then I want to rename seed to seed async. It's important to me that once an operation becomes asynchronous, that you have some indication, and naming is a good way to handle that. Now we've gotten rid of all the errors, we're going to go ahead and have the user manager look for this user, and if the user equals null, we're going to need to create it. This is essentially the same thing we did when we looked in the context for any products. Even though the context is responsible for the database, the user manager allows us to go through the identity system and define a new user. So let's say user equals new store user, and then we can just set some properties here, like first name, Sean, last name, you guessed it, Wildermuth, email, and our username, which is required, is also sean@dutchtreat.com. Now you can have systems where the username is different than the email, but we're going to use email for both. That sort of guarantees uniqueness for us. It's not a must-have, but it's an easier way to handle it in some systems. And once we have this, we want to use the user manager to create it. And notice it's create async, so we actually have to get the result and use a wait to go ahead and create it asynchronously. We're going to pass in that new user, and then we're going to give it a password. I'm going to start with P @SSW0RD exclamation point. Now, the identity system itself has a way to define how complex passwords have to be. So if your instinct here is to just put a really simple password here, the default does require upper and lowercase characters and at least one number. But if you get an error with it creating the user, it's probably because you tried to simplify this password too much. There are ways to configure that, but we're not going to have a chance to show that quite yet. And if the result does not equal identity result success, in other words, if it didn't actually create the new user, let's throw a new invalid operation exception, could not create new user in Cedar. Now that we have this new user, we can guarantee the first time that we get it here or when we're creating it, we want to be able to use it down here. Remember, we're getting the order from the database because we created it via the migrations. Before we set the order here, we can just say order.user equals our user. And this will actually update the order to be owned by our user as well. And so this is allowing us to do really both. Even though we're not going through the context to create the new store user, we are allowing the store user to be set as a property on the order through the context. If we build it, just to make sure everything works, we're going to get a warning. Let's go over to this warning real quick. And the warning is that this seed async, remember we renamed it, I did it using Visual Studio, so it automatically changed it everywhere it was. But this is now an asynchronous method. It's returning a task. And so the instinct might be to go ahead and try to make this into asynchronous and then make this into asynchronous. And it starts to get a little silly. Because this is a sort of one time when the operation starts up, I'm going to go ahead and just wait for it to complete, to make it a synchronous method, even though the whole operation is going to support asynchronicity. We're not actually going to use it in that way. We're just going to say, go do the seeding, and I'll wait here, I'll block here until it's done. Back in the console, let's go ahead and use the .NET EF tool to drop the database. We're doing this because during development, sometimes the migrations we're building might not be compatible with older versions. So just to be clean, let's go ahead and drop the database since we don't have any real data in there. Go ahead and say yes. And once it's done that, let's go ahead and run our project with the seed to go ahead and rerun the seeding. All done. And now we can go and actually configure identity in our project. So now let's configure identity inside of our startup. In the startup, we need to configure this in a couple of different ways. Let's start up here and just say services.add identity. An identity is going to require two generic arguments. First, the store user that we talked about earlier. We'll bring in entities and identity role, which is also in the identity namespace. This identity role is in case we're going to configure roles. It works a lot of the same way that store user does, in that it is a type of data that can be stored about a user, but we could derive identity role to have our own role class if we needed that. But because we're not really using that, we'll just leave it as identity role. Now, one of the things we'll want to do here is actually do some configuration for the identity. So the configuration allows me to make some decisions about different parts of the system. So for instance, I could say user require unique email equals true. That way more than one user can't have the same email. I could also set password rules. And this is where all those rules that determine how complex a password has to be. If you look at these, you can put together the kind of strength you want. But we're just going to use the unique email for now. And add identity has a fluent syntax, so we can then add where we're going to get the data. And in our case, that's going to be from the entity framework stores. And we're going to tell it that our data is being stored in the Dutch context. The idea here is that we're telling it the type of context to use internally in identity when it wants to get at the different objects that are stored in the database. Some people like to keep their two stores separately, so they'll have a context for identity and then they'll have a context for their data. Because our project is fairly simple, I've combined them into one, especially useful because I'm having related entities between the identity objects, like our store user, and our simple entities like order. Once I've added all the identity pieces, now back in configure, we're going to go down, and after we call use routing, we're going to need to call use authentication. Authentication is about identifying the user, so it needs to go first, and then we can add use authorization. Authorization we're going to actually use later on in this chapter when we use identity with your APIs. And so now that we have this added to the pipeline, we can go ahead and test to see that this works. So let's run this for a moment. And let's refresh that page that was trying to go to shop. And what we'll see is it redirected our call to this account login page. This is a configurable path if you wanted to use it, but we'll just implement it as an account controller. And it has as the return path the original place we wanted to go. So the next step would be actually implementing this logon page to make sure that we get the entire cycle of allowing login and then taking us back to that page. Let's do that next. So now let's design the login view. So let's go up to our controllers. Let's create a new controller called Account Controller. And we're going to drive this from controller. And let's create a constructor and add iLogger for Account Controller. We'll bring in the logging namespace and then create a field for it. For the login page, we're just going to need an action result called login. And we're simply just going to return a view. But let's actually use the information in identity to make sure that login is the correct thing. We can check for the user, which is a property on the controller itself, and ask for the identity object on the user, and ask is authenticated. And so this essentially is going to say, has someone already logged in? Has the identity system already made a user a current thing? And is authenticated is a property that says, yes, someone's already logged in. And if they've already logged in, the login page isn't useful. So to make sure people don't accidentally just type in login and get confused, I'm just going to return a redirect to action. And redirect to action is a redirection to a specific controller and action. So in this case, I'm going to give the action name as index and the controller name as app. So this will figure out what the URL is for the index action on the app controller and redirect them. So sort of a safety valve in case people go to log in while they're already logged in. So let's create the view. And first we'll need a directory called account, and then I'll go ahead and create the login.cshtml as just a simple page. So to get started with our login page, let's go ahead and open up that contact view, and we're just going to borrow the scripts and the title block. Now the title block, of course, is going to say login. And we're going to continue to use these scripts for validation, just like we did on the contact page, but we're going to build our own. So let's start with a div and give it a class of row. So we can start that row. And then we want to create our form in the middle of the page, just like we did with the contact page. So we're just going to start with another div, and we'll use the classes of column medium 6. So on a medium page and larger, we'll go ahead and take half the page, and then we'll do the same thing for offset and use 3 just to push it into the center. Again, we've already done this with contact page, so this should be review. Go ahead and create our form, and then we'll simply just start with the first field on the form. So I'm going to start with form group as just a collection around that. And then we're going to need a label, and this will say username, and then an input and a span for our validation information. But before we can actually do this, we need to have a view model, because we're going to collect this information as a view model and then obviously use validation to make that work. So before we continue writing this, let's go into view models and let's create a new log and view model class. And this is just going to have 3 simple properties: a string for username, a string for password, and a Boolean for remember me. So that they can simply check a checkbox and say, go ahead and save my credentials for me. We're going to use validation here, much like we have already a couple times, and just say we want the username required and the password required. Booleans we don't really want required because it doesn't matter, but we just want to make sure they've actually put in a username and a password. Now that we've added that, let's add the model declaration for our login view model. Let's turn green so we know that it's recognized it, and then we can start to use those tag helpers. ASP for equals username. Do the same down here for password. And then ASP validation for username. I mean, all three of these should be for username. I don't know what I'm thinking. Let's go ahead and copy this twice more because we have 3 pieces of information. We have a password, but of course we want our type to be password here to make sure that it's nice and hidden. And then we'll put the validation for password as well. For this third one, we're just going to change the ASP4s to remember me. But because we're not going to use a traditional input here, we're going to want to use Bootstrap's capability of using a checkbox instead. But in order to do this as a checkbox using Bootstrap, we're going to have to change these a little. First, I'm going to reorder the label in the input so that the label is after the actual checkbox. And then I'm going to wrap both of these in a new div, and I'm going to give it a class of form check. And instead of giving it the class here, I am going to tell it that the type should be checkbox. Unless we need to give both of these their own class of form check input, so it knows where to format the actual input. And then on the label, just change this to label. We'll go ahead and just show the validation as well, though the reality is that checkbox being checked or unchecked isn't going to give us a whole lot of differences. And now that we have the checkbox, let's go ahead and create one last form group. In this case, we're just going to create an input of type submit, value is going to be login, and then we'll just use some classes to make it look like a better button. So button success. And if we go ahead and run this, so let's go back and try to go to that shop page and see whether our login page is actually working. If we go ahead and use our DutchTreat.com, we try to log in, we're going to get the errors like we're actually used to. But notice that they're not colored very well, so the users might not see them very easily. So let's make one more change, and that is in these spans, let's just add class text warning. We'll add this to each one of them, much like we've done before. Firefox is doing some creative filling in for me, which isn't helping. And now we can see that it's a little more visible. And of course, you could use any technique you want to change the way this looks on the page, but for now this is a usable login. The only thing I don't like is it's super wide. So let's make one more change before we go on and implement the actual logic behind the login. To come back up here, and let's actually make it only 4 wide and an offset of 4. So that way it's still centered in the page because we're moving 4 columns to the right and then only taking up 4 columns. Because the controls are going to try to make themselves as wide as the actual columns that we're using. If we do that, then it looks a little better in the way we want. If we wanted it to the left or the right, we could change those columns. Bootstrap's our friend there. Next, let's implement the actual logic behind this. So now that we have the login view, let's implement login and logout so we can add them to our layout. If we open up the account controller, before we can implement login and logout, we're going to need a new service. This service is called Sign In Manager, and it takes the type of user, in our case, store user, and I'll just call it the Sign In Manager and initialize that field. And we'll need to bring in the namespace for store users as well. And now we can actually implement the post. So we're going to start with an action result, like we have done before. We're going to say login, and like we did for the contact page, we're going to take that view model and accept it as the data we're going to be sent. And let's just call that model. And for us, we're going to want to specify that this is going to be a post. Because our form here in login, this is a form that once it's been submitted, we'll want to post back to the server, which will find it here in the login. Since we're using post, we want to make sure that in the login.cshtml that we have the method equals post to tell it what kind of verb to use when this sends the data back to the server. So the first thing we want to do is just check model state is valid. Because we have these validation rules inside of the view model, we want to go ahead and just make sure it's valid. And inside the if statement, deep down, we're going to eventually redirect to the same view. So let's just come down here and say return view, because if we've fallen down through all of these pieces, the model state might not be valid. We might add our own errors. Eventually, we're going to go back to that page unless we successfully log in. And in that case, we'll actually go back to the return URL or the home page, depending on which they picked. So let's do the actual sign-in. We're going to get the result of a call to the sign-in manager called password sign-in async. This method, password sign-in async, is going to allow us to sign in with just the username and the password instead of having to go and get the actual store user object. So we can just use the model here to say model.username, model.password. Next, we'll need to pass in the remember me, and this is a Boolean that says, should I make this login persistent? Should I save it on the machine in some length? And the configuration can tell us how long those persistent cookies should last. 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, whatever it is. And the last thing we're going to say is lockout on failure, and I'm just going to say false for now, but this would allow you to lock the account if the username and password don't match correctly. So in the face of this, this should work, except we can be hinted that the end of the method is called async. That means that what this is actually returning is a task. This should be a hint that we actually want our action to be async and to use await to call that async method. So let's wrap our action result in a task and call await here so we get the actual result we want. If we hover over the result, we can see it's now a sign-in result. And then we can just test if result.succeeded, then we can go ahead and try to do the right thing for our operation. Let's assume we just wanted to say when they signed in, let's send them to some static place. We could say redirect to action, and then just send them to the shop page of the app. And if you remember, when the authorized attribute was used, it forwarded us to the login page, but added this query string value called return URL that said where to go once they successfully log in. So we can do that by saying, let's look at the request, let's look at the query, and look at the keys in the query. And the keys meaning the key and the key value pair. And if that contains return URL, then we can redirect it separately. Otherwise, we'll default down to just going to our shop page, or home page if you prefer. And now we can just say redirect, and then give it an URL, and we can just get that by saying request.query, return URL first. First tells it to get the first value inside the query string, though typically query strings are single valued. Because this is a collection that could be used in multiple places, you need to call first to get the first value inside the return URL. And the final thing we'll want to do is if we get down here, if we've fallen through whether the model state was invalid or whether this failed, we're going to come down here. Let's go ahead and add model state.add model error, and I'm going to put an empty string for the error because this isn't a problem with one of the values on the view model, but actually an error for the entire model, and that is failed to log in. We could tell it exactly what is wrong, like username and password don't match, or the format of the password is wrong, format of the username is wrong, but on purpose we want to be a little cagey here and just give them the broad error of failed to log in. Unless, in our case with our rules, we did want to hint to them, hey, you need at least a username and a password specified, but we're not going to go into any more depth than that. If we go back to the login view, we'll just need a place to put that. We can just add a div here with ASP validation summary and then model only. This will display near the top of the form a summary, but only include the model-only errors. The rest of the errors, if they're specific to one of the parts of the model, will show up in their own ASP.NET validation pieces. Let's go ahead and run this and view it in the browser. And we can come to this page even though we're not logged in, but when we go to Shop, it's going to take us to the login page. And let's give it a bad password first. You'll see the error here, failed to log in, because this is at the model level, not that either one of these or both of these are wrong. So let's try it again with the right password. We can see it redirects us to Shop. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and open the layout. So now in the layout, we want to add a login and logout button. So let's start by just copying our shop part of the nav bar. I'm going to change this to login for the action, and I'm going to use the account controller because that seems like the most logical place to put it. And what we want to do is show login only if they're not logged in. So we're going to do if user identity is authenticated. And if we're authenticated, I'm going to show a logout button. Otherwise, I'll show our login button. We'll just copy this again, and instead of log in, we'll just do log out. Same for the action. And this way we can show part of the menu items whether someone's logged in or not. This way we can do the full round trip of logging in, seeing ourselves logged in, and then log back out. Now let's go back to the account controller and implement those actions. This again is going to be a public action result. We'll just call it logout. And it can be HTTP GET. We don't need an actual post here, because if we come to this action, we're going to assume they want to actually log out. No matter what happens in the logout, we're going to redirect to action, and that action is going to be index app. But we need to do the actual login, and we can use the sign-in manager to do that. And the method is sign out async. Because it is async, we do need to make this an async. Wrap our action result around a task and just say await. And let's return that redirect to action. So this is a very simple action in that it will take us back to the home page, but it will also attempt to sign us out. So if we run this, let's see if we can do the entire cycle of login and logout. There's our page, and it says we are logged in because this says logout. Let's go to the shop page. It doesn't require us to be on that page. If we click logout, it'll take us back, log us out, and take us back to that home page, so the login button is still there. So here at the login, if we just put in our credentials and press login, it'll go ahead and take us back to the shop. Pressing logout will take us back to the home page and leave our login information. So if we have our website with our views using authentication, can't I just use the same cookie authentication that the built-in providers use for my API? And the answer is yes, you can use cookies, but it is the least secure. It does mean that only your web page will be able to access the APIs once they've logged into a non-API part of your page. And if you're building a simple couple of pages that might be using Angular or some other technology, that might be fine, but it is not very secure because that cookie can be grabbed, and for the lifetime of the cookie, which may be 20 minutes, 20 hours, or 20 weeks, that cookie could be reused to call that API. The difference here is that calling an API is changing data potentially, and so the risk of having a less secure way has a higher chance of messing with your system. So I'm going to try to dissuade you from using cookies and show you another way, but if you have to use cookies, there is security there, it's just not the most secure. You can also use OpenID, Auth2, or JWT tokens, which are the ones I'm going to show you. The big deal here on which way you go is depending on your security requirements. Anytime you're dealing with potential access to data, like if you're building a bank site, you're going to want to use the most secure method possible. But remember, you might be dealing with a smaller company or a smaller website. You might still want to go down the road of using tokens, because some of the data that you could be exposing through your API could be just as dangerous. Like if you were storing credit cards in a e-commerce situation, you don't want someone to have an API that could potentially charge things through your system, create false orders, or even access that specialized data. So you have to make the decision yourself, what makes the most sense. Let's look at using identity in the API and specifically using tokens. So if we come down to the bottom and open up that startup.cs, if you remember, we added this identity in order to store our identity objects in the database. This is all really useful to understand how you're going to identify our user, but that actually doesn't turn on how to manage that authentication. So what we need to do is actually add authentication, and then after add authentication, we're actually going to add different kinds of authentication we're going to use. And the one we've been using so far that is actually the default, but as soon as we call add authentication, we'll need to do it ourselves, is add cookie. Because the website changes, the redirection and all that is dependent on the cookie. But we're adding it explicitly here because we want to add the token support as well. And that requires add JWT bearer. That is the kind of token we're going to use. A JSON web token as a bearer token. And that'll make more sense as we go along. But you notice it's not recognizing it, and even if I try to resolve it, it doesn't know where it is. And that is, you might have guessed, in another NuGet package. So let's come up here and just say JWT bearer, and that should find it for us. Here it is, authentication, JWT bearer. Let's go ahead and install it. And if we go back to startup, we'll see that it actually resolved now. We don't have to change anything down here because we had already turned on authentication and authorization. By supporting both of these, let's go ahead and look to see if anything changes in our app. Let's log out, and if we go to shop, continues to work just like it always has. Right? So we've included the cookie-based authentication that all of this stuff works at, but what if we're actually calling APIs from JavaScript, from some other client that we want to expose from the same site, which is a pretty common occurrence. So what if we went to the controllers and let's say go to the orders controller and added authorize here. Just like we did for the shop page in the app controller, we're going to do it at the entire level of the order controller. We're going to say to access it all, you're going to need to be authorized in some way. So back in Postman, if I just try to get all the orders, something weird happens. We get a 302 found. 302 found really means please redirect for me. I've got Postman set up to not follow redirects, and let me show you what that is. Depending on how you have it installed, this becomes important. So if you look at the settings for Postman, one of the options is automatically follow redirects. This is actually turned on by default. And what happens in that case is that we actually get a 200 OK that we succeeded in getting the orders. But what did we actually get? We actually got the login page. You can see that here because login is in there. Because what did it do? It did the same thing that the web pages did, and that is I tried to access this, therefore I'm going to redirect to the login for you. But this isn't how APIs want to be authenticated. We want it to actually give us a 401 or a 403 to tell us whether we're authorized or that we require authentication. So if we come back here to authorize, we can actually tell it to use this new JWT scheme instead. And we can do this by saying authentication schemes equal, and we're going to use JWT bearer defaults. And we're then going to specify authentication scheme as the default we're looking for. And this effectively is the name bearer as the name of the scheme that we want to use for authorization. Now that we've specified that we're not going to use cookies at all here, we're going to use JWT bearers only. If we execute this, we're going to get the status of 401. No redirection happens here because redirection is only part of the cookie authentication. So by not using cookie authentication for our APIs, we get around this entirely. 401 effectively says you needed to tell me about the credentials of the user trying to execute this. I can't guess for you. So in order to specify these, we have to actually include a header. So if we go to headers, we can add authorization, the name of the header, even though it's really authentication. And we're going to say bearer, and then this magic string that contains credentials. We can't have it contain the actual credentials we want because that can be problematic. If we send this now, we're still getting unauthorized because really what's happening is that this bearer token is unrecognized. The way this system works is that we're going to need to call an API with credentials, and it's going to give us a magic string to pass in every other call in this authorization header. So let's see how to create that token, and then we'll see how to make it actually recognize it. Let's open up the account controller, and let's create a public action result for create token. And let's make this an HTTP post. And we're making it a post because we don't actually want to include credential information in the header or in a query string. And get doesn't allow us to send information in the body. So let's go ahead and put in from body, because you may notice that the rest of these calls inside account are really resolving themselves to a view, but this is actually going to be a REST call. We don't need to create a separate kind of controller for these sort of one-offs. The reality is this REST call is part of the account system, not separate from it. And I'll just use that same login view model that we did earlier and do the same is valid to see whether we actually want to create the token. If it gets down to the bottom without any successful creation of the token, we'll just return bad request. Something that was sent to us, whether authentication didn't work or whatever the case, is a bad request. And what we're going to want to do is figure out whether the login actually works. Now we could use signinmanager.password signin, but this is actually going to sign them in with a cookie. And that's not actually what we want to do. So what we really need to do is just check the password. Check the password requires that we use that store user and then check the password itself. And it doesn't actually change any state. It just gives us a result back whether those credentials are okay. So we're going to actually need to get the user first. We can do that by calling a class called user manager. So let's go back up to the top, and we're going to need a third required element, and that is a user manager. This takes that store user as a type again, and then we'll just say user manager and create and initialize a field. And we'll just use find by name async. And where are we going to get the name? Model.username. And because this says async, we're going to need to await from it, which of course means that we need to make the entire action asynchronous as well. Don't forget to wrap the result in a task. And if the user does not equal null, in other words, it was found, then we can go ahead and check the password. We do that by now passing in the user and then the model.password and saying false for lockout on failure, because that's not really what we want. If result succeeded, then we can actually create the token. So in order to create the token, we need to do a couple of things. First, we need to get the claims. Claims are a set of properties with well-known values in them, though you could use any values, that can be stored in the token and used by the client or when it's passed back to the server. So we're going to need a new claim, and claims are found inside the system.security claim subsystem. And to create a claim, we need a type and a value. And the type we're going to get actually from JWT registered claim names, which is deep down in system identity model tokens.jwt, that contain the standard names that are used inside of the claims for a token. We only need a couple of these. You can include more of these if you want to include some lookup information when the token comes in and is used, or even in the client. For us, we're first just going to say sub, which is the name of the subject, and the value is just going to be user.email. We're going to use that as the sub, and then we also need a claim for JTI. The JTI is a unique string that's representative of each token, and so I usually just use GUID, new GUID to string. The last one of these we're going to need is a JWT registered claim name's unique name. Unique name is going to be the username of the user and is actually mapped to the identity inside the user object that is available on every controller and view for that matter. So we'll just want to say user.username in that case. And that way our token is going to contain enough information to tie together the current user in the API to the actual store user that we need for our relational model. Let's go ahead and make some room down here because we're going to need to do a few things. So to start, we're going to need a key, and this is going to be a key that we're going to use to create a signature to validate this token. We can do this with a new symmetric security key. The security key takes a series of bytes that represent that key. Now, where are we going to actually get those bytes? We're going to get them from the configuration file. So let's go ahead and open our configuration file, and let's add a new section called tokens. And we're going to need a few things in here, but let's just start with the key we need. And this is going to be some random set of text that we're going to use as the key. So I'm just going to create some garbage in here. When we publish this, we're going to put it in an actual key. But again, this is just used to validate that the signing part of the JWT token is going to be the same when it comes back in so that we know it is not only valid, but it hasn't been changed. So back in account controller, we're going to need to get the key. And so the way we're going to get it is to actually come back up here to the top. And we're going to add as a new injectable piece iConfiguration, right? Because we need to be able to get the configuration object. I'll go ahead and create it as a member. Let's go back down to the bottom. And then we can just use config token : key, right? But of course this returns a string and we need a byte. And so we need to actually encode it. So we're going to use encoding.utf8 get bytes. This will essentially take this string and return it as UTF-8 encoded bytes. Let's go ahead and put a semicolon there. What we need to do is then turn this key into a set of credentials. And so this is going to be signing credentials. And this is going to be the security key that we created and then which algorithm we're going to want to use for this credential. And you can see this in the security algorithms where we have a number of different encryption algorithms. And the one that I normally use is HMAC SHA 256, 384, or 512. And I'll use 256 in our case. With that, we can actually go ahead and create the token. And we're going to do this by creating a new JWT security token. And we can see that the first two arguments are issuer and audience. There's also going to be claims and then a few other properties that we're going to set. But let's start with the issue, audience, and claims. And these are just strings. And then claims, unsurprisingly, are going to be actually our claims here. But we can't have the issuer and audience be empty strings. We actually need to know who issued it, which is us, and what the audience is for. And these are used to figure out what kind of token can be used in certain cases. But in our case, let's go ahead and just say config token issuer. And the trick here is we're putting in configuration because we're going to allow ourselves to check it when we validate this token on the way back in. Remember, we're generating the token to use here, and then later we'll revalidate it. And that'll be audience, right? And then we can just say claims. So we need these in the configuration. So let's go back to configuration and add issuer. And in this case, I'm just actually going to put our address. Now, again, this is validated on both sides. So we're not actually going to validate that this is coming from our website address. At no point is JWT checking this against actual URLs. It's just a name that specifies who we are. And the audience for it, I'm going to use the same thing. Actually, this should be localhost, right? The audience for this token is us. Now that it's in the configuration, let's go back. And there's a couple more here. We're going to need to actually specify the signature. And instead of specifying every single property that we need here, what we're actually going to use is signing credentials equal creds. And notice I'm using the parameter name here because I don't want to just put in empty names. And I also need expiration. Or expires, I should say. This is where we're going to specify how long this lives. And I'm going to say date, time, UTC now, and I'm going to add minutes 20. This is where we're actually specifying how long this lives. And so you could change the way this works a little bit, but for our need, that should be plenty. And And finally, we're going to want to return this as something that includes the data. So we're going to say return created. And because we really don't have an URL for the location, we're just going to leave an empty string. We could have a location put in there as well. But as we saw when we were creating APIs in the last module, we could actually construct created here, but we're not going to have an endpoint that they can actually deal with this. And we're going to go ahead and create a new anonymous object as the actual payload. So what am I going to do here? I'm going to say token. I can't just say token equals token here. What I'm actually going to want to do is say new JWT security token handler, and then just write token. And here I'm going to pass in that token. It's going to convert this into a plain old string. So this will be the string version that can be passed in and back to us, not just the structure of the token information, which is really what this JWT security token is. And for simplification, we're going to actually give it an expiration as well. That way it doesn't need to dive into the token to figure out the expiration. It's a convenience so that our client later, when we write it, will know exactly what time this expired. To set the expiration, we're just going to go to the token and say valid to. This is going to return a date time of when the token is valid until, after which, of course, is going to be invalid. Now that we can create our token, let's go over and test this. So let's create a new tab, and we're going to post to get our token by calling HTTP, localhost, account, create token, which is what we called it, but we do need to send the body as JSON with our credentials in it, username and password. See what happens when we send this? You can see here that it's returned a JSON object that contains the expiration as well as the actual token. And this token, if we copy the whole thing, there's some line wrapping going. If we come back to our orders, this is what goes here for the bearer. It's a long, long key. If we issue it, we're still getting unauthorized. Why is that? The reason is we need to tell startup about our bearer token. So we're going to use configuration again to do that. And so what we need to do in the configuration is actually set up the token validation parameters, or the parameters that need to be used to validate the token that we're sending in. So we're going to validate that it has a valid issuer, and here's the issuer that we got from the configuration file. Same for the audience, and then we're going to specify a key based on the issuer signing key. And this key, just like we did before, is just based on the key that's inside the configuration file. So if we save this, and send it, we'll see that we're now getting our data back. And even if we go to other APIs, because the entire order controller is supported, the same bearer can be used for whatever that timeout is, 20 minutes, 20 hours, however you want to create that token. The only thing that you need is that magic string that was passed to us, and that magic string contains the information to know that it is a valid token that was generated by the server from credentials. It does not contain the actual credentials. So now that we have cookie-based and token-based authentication working, let's use this authentication information directly in our code. Now let's use identity in read operations. If we come back to Visual Studio, let's go to the orders controller, and because our call to get here now has the context of a user, because we're using authorization in the entire controller, we now know who the user is. So let's get a username here. We can do that by just calling user.identity.name. And let's change and create a new method called get all orders by user. Make sure I get the casing right. And then we can just pass in the username as the first argument and that included items so that we can use that in both cases. Let's implement this new type. I'm just going to move this to make it a little cleaner and make sure we want to return orders just like the other call. And then in our repository, let's implement this. And then let's just copy this code from get all orders. for when we implement this. And the only difference between these two is that we're going to include a where clause. o.user.username equals username. So even though the where only includes the name, we can actually walk down that chain in our where clause. And we'll do the same thing for the simple one. Let's save that and go back to Postman, and let's go ahead and send this. Hopefully the bearer token hasn't expired yet. And now we can get this order, and we happen to know that this order only belongs to this user. But this way later, when we add orders under the auspices of different users, this call to orders is going to be in the context of the actual user using this call. And we can do this throughout our API. If we had views that did this same thing, where someone logged into the system and was using cookies, we could use the same mechanism to filter out the results that we're generating from the views, though we're not going to be doing that in our particular application. We're going to be doing it with Angular, so doing it in the API makes more sense. Now that we have this working in the orders controller, let's repeat it in the order items controller, because we're going to need that later. So we're going to repeat adding the authorize attribute, and then we're going to need the JWT bearer defaults authentication scheme, and we're going to do that by saying authentication schemes equal. So we're going to limit the order items also to this token, and we're going to change the get order by ID to include the user.identity.name. So if we navigate over to the interface, we can just add string username, and then of course change that in the repository. And then we can just extend that where clause to say where o.user.username equals the username. This guarantees that someone asking for an ID for an order that doesn't belong to them won't be able to get it. This will just return a null in the case of the ID doesn't belong to this particular user. Makes it a little safer for us. And because of this, we're going to have to fix everywhere we're using get by order ID to also use that identity name. One last use was in the order items. And so we have this working really everywhere inside the orders and the order items controllers. Now let's look at how we can use it in write operations. Now let's use identity in the write operations. If we go back to the orders controller, we have a post call here. And this post will create new orders, but it won't necessarily know who the owner of that order is. And the trick here is when we're creating that new order, before we add the entity in, we need to set that. So the first thing we're going to need is new order.user equals, and we'll call it current user. So we need to be able to get this current user. And how do we do that? We need to use the user manager again. So we'll need to add the user manager to our orders controller, or we could have done this in the repository as well, but I find it better to do it here in the orders controller for not any good reason. I'll bring in that namespace and just call it user manager and create the field again. And then here I'll call user manager, find by name, and then pass in user.identity.name. So there's a difference between this user and what we're thinking about as user, because this user is actually just the list of claims for our user. It isn't the database representation of a store user, and that's why we have to actually go get it. Because it's async, we need to use await, and because this isn't async yet, we'll go ahead and add async and wrap it in a task. And so when we save new users in the database, we'll now assign this current user to them. So back in Postman, let's go to that post where we were creating new orders. And remember that we still need the authorization token. So let's copy that and put it over here. Let's make this authorization. So even on post or write operations, we're going to need that same bearer token. And then our body, let's give it a different number. We'll see the new order was created because our authorization inserted it into our project. We go back to getting the orders. we can see we're getting all the orders for the user that were assigned, both the one that we'd seeded and then these new orders, even though we haven't added items to them. Let's wrap up this module. So what have we learned? I've shown you how Identity can use an existing DB context, or you could really just have your own DB context directly for Identity, though combining them isn't uncommon at all. I've shown you how the Authorize attribute can help you control who has access to views or APIs. And we've configured Identity to change some of the way it behaves out of the box to better match the kind of things that you want Identity to do. Up next, we're going to introduce you to TypeScript before we dive into Angular.